Hi everyone, we'll just wait for everyone to come in and join us for this webinar today before we do our introduction. So thanks for making time on what is probably quite a busy Tuesday in everywhere else except university land where everyone's on holiday. So it's a very quiet building that we're in today. We've had a great turnout today of about over 200 people. I'm expecting we'll get a good 100 of you or so dialing in, but of course it is being recorded. So if you know colleagues who weren't able to make it today, there'll be plenty of opportunities to watch this recording at a later date. So numbers are starting to stabilize. We'll give it till midday anyway before we start, because there'll be a few people logging in at the last minute. So last chance to get your cup of tea ready, although you've probably left it too late for that by now, I would say. Yep, there's a bit of a jump in numbers now that 12 is almost upon us. So we'll just give everyone just another minute prior to starting, or maybe 30 seconds or so. For those of you just joining us at midday, we're just waiting for the last people to log in, and then we'll be underway in just a few moments, so won't be long. Good time to remember to mute my phone. Right, okay, look, we'll make a start. I'm Theo Brandt, I'm the Information Manager at the Immunisation Advisory Centre. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today, as part of our COVID-19 webinar series, we're going to be discussing engaging with the vaccine hesitant. And this presentation, we're very pleased, has been brought to you in collaboration with Auckland District Health Board. As you can see up on your screen, we're actually beaming into the DHB lecture theatre. So there's a real live audience there as well, I believe. So yeah, as I said, this is part of our ongoing webinar series. And if you can't stay for the whole duration, or if you've got colleagues who wanted to see it, we will be making this recording available on our website. That will probably be within a week or earlier, depending on how quickly we can turn it around. Just to note that we don't have chat enabled on Zoom for the attendees. You're very welcome to ask questions through the Q&A function. There's a big Q&A button down there, so just pop a question in there, and after our two presenters have presented, we'll have plenty of time to answer any specific questions. And also a special thank you to those behind the scenes, to Olivia and Kimberly, who will be helping manage those calls. And I think what I might do is just quickly introduce everyone who is on screen before we start, seeing everyone's here. We've got Dr. Anthony Jordan, who's a physician, clinical immunologist and allergist at Auckland DHB, where he treats patients with disorders of the immune system and has worked in the COVID-19 work streams over the past year. He's a member of the NRHCC vaccination program clinical governance group and Te Rupu Whakakaupapa Urata, which is the National Māori Pandemic Group. And Anthony will be talking to us in just a little while. We've also got Dr. Karina Gray, who's a public health physician and Pacific Health Data lead at ADHB. And she's also been involved in the COVID response planning, outbreak management, and more recently, vaccine planning with a focus on Pacific populations. Karina's made herself available today to answer any questions that people might have specifically on Pacific populations or ones that are sort of more down her neck of the woods. But now what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Jess Berentson-Shaw. She is the co-director of the workshop and a public narrative researcher and advisor. She gained her PhD in health psychology from Victoria University in 2003. And enrolls across government and the not-for-profit sectors. She's focused on placing best knowledge and equity at the heart of decision-making. And since 2017, Jess has been researching and implementing narrative strategies that engage, deepen people's thinking and improve decision making with regards to what are some of our biggest social and environmental challenges. Today, she's going to discuss key communication principles and then make that connection through to how we talk about immunisation. So Jess, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Kia ora. Thanks, Theo. That's quite a mouthful, I realised. We should probably shorten that bio next time. I'm just going to share my screen now and get started on what will be a very rapid 20 minutes. I'm going to hit that target this time, I'm sure of it, and talk through some of those high-level principles for people. So here we go. Here we go. Great. Can everyone see that? I can... Olivia, Karina, can you give me the thumbs up if you can see it? Because I can't see anyone else on screen at the moment.
All good.
Oh, great. All good. Super. Okay. So today I'm just going to very briefly go through what the goals of talking about COVID vaccinations are, why some of the default ways that we tend to communicate can be a problem in this space, what to avoid, how to do it instead, and a little bit on the interpersonal communication and conversations, because much of my research sort of sits at a slightly higher level, which is how do we communicate more broadly across communities, but lots that applies in that kind of interpersonal conversation space. So, goals for talking about COVID. Really, we have to think about them in terms of connecting and building trust. It's not simply about information, it is about relationships. We want to avoid reinforcing false information, of which I know that we're all worried about. We want to deepen understanding about vaccination benefits and the risks of COVID-19. And we want to support people to make well-informed decisions based on some specific values and principles as well, and particularly around collective well-being. So that's the kind of the broader kind of goals. I want to start with a very, very brief overview of the theory that we work in and why our kind of traditional ways of communicating can be problematic. So, and why facts and individual stories, why we can't just tell people that vaccination works, or perhaps why we can't give people a good, strong emotive story about what happens when people don't get vaccinated, and why that won't change minds. So I'll give you the kind of flying overview of the theory. First of all, there's some internal stuff going on, and we use this term fast thinking brains, which is really our cognitive systems, which uses a whole lot of, and you might have heard this term, mental shortcuts, to help us process and work our way through the world every day. And these shortcuts, things like confirmation bias or normalcy bias, some of you would have heard of some of these terms, status quo bias, while they protect what we already know and believe and mean that we don't have to do a whole lot of work just to figure out how to open a Weet-Bix packet in the morning, they can work to surface and protect some unhelpful thinking that we might have already been exposed to and is set in place in our thinking. One of the really important mental shortcuts that's used when we think about science or vaccination is trust. So we use trust and perceptions of expertise as a mental shortcut, so we don't have to reassess all of the information. And it's really important to remember that trust and expertise isn't just a given. It's built through people's personal experience, and it's built through communities' actual experience with both the science community, the medical community, and the government community as well. And that your expertise, while might be hard won, isn't necessarily an expertise that somebody might see in you. So we have to think about trust and expertise slightly differently when we're thinking about communication, because it is a mental shortcut that people use. So we've got the internal processes, but we've also got dominant narratives, and those dominant narratives might simply be overwhelming. We get a huge amount of information that we're being exposed to every day. So that means our fast thinking brain has to work particularly hard to bat off a whole lot of information that we don't need to stop and process. But also we're increasingly exposed to a set of manipulated narratives and stories, which hold a number of untruths in them. And because of digital media especially, we get exposed to more of those. It's not that the manipulation of information is anything new. Go back to the history of human beings and communication, and you will find that our narratives have been manipulated by people for personal reasons, profit motives, all sorts of things. But we are, through social media, being exposed to them. Social media algorithms particularly are built to help us share alarming and often untrue information as well. So there's that particular manipulation going on. And what happens is both our and I'll just say, just to mention, that false information that people are exposed to, and that includes minimisation, of which we've seen quite a lot of in COVID. So you'll, for example, a good example of false information that's minimisation is that COVID isn't as bad as the flu. That will be an example of that. And it's political. And it's important to remember that it's political. It's not just something that has happened out of any kind of neutral environment. People have motives and reasons. There's power and equity issues involved in false information. The kind of high level take home is that what happens is our internal processes, our fast brains, work with our information environment. There's a feedback loop between these two things, where the unhelpful thoughts we might hold and are being protected by our fast thinking systems are also being shared in our dominant narratives, and then they come in to feed our mental models. And all of this can create a bit of a kind of a nasty mix of unhelpful thinking at a very surface level for people. But then we get this problem, which is that often for us as professionals, as experts, as advocates, we tend to treat failure to understand as a bit of an individual cognitive weakness or as a deficit of information. So we don't realise that there's this information and data out there about fast thinking systems, or we don't think about the dominant narratives that people are being exposed to. And instead we might think of people as not having enough information. And occasionally you hear people say, oh, people are just stupid, they just don't understand it. And that's where we see the individual cognitive weakness argument come through. And what that means is when we take that mental shortcut, because it's a mental shortcut that we as communicators and experts ourselves can take, we tend to default communicate. And what that means is our default communication often leads with facts and problems. We'll use the unhelpful or opposition's kind of false story to try and tell a new story. This often looks like myth busting or rebutting false information as our kind of primary means. And unfortunately, what the science shows us is that that can reinforce unhelpful information and thinking, because actually exposure to untrue information is one of the ways that it beds down. We also have terrible source confusion. We often forget where we hear information. So any myth busting that comes from a good source can actually be recalled as false information from that good trustworthy source. And what that means is that we might say that vaccines are safe and not harmful, but the kinds of thinking that we end up surfacing is not the kind of thinking that we want people to reflect on. It might be unhelpful thinking, and we might be reinforcing it. So that's the kind of the problem in a very high level, quick overview of why facts don't work and why emotive stories don't work the way that we perhaps feel they should. And what are the solutions? Well, there's some high level principles that it's important to think about. The first is we really want to be thinking about connecting with people, over correcting them. So this is about, as I said at the beginning, this is about relationship over information. Next, it's really important to think about how you want to build your narrative. So getting very clear on what the story about vaccination and what it does for us and how it can help us is, and use that narrative to communicate through. Don't communicate through the untrue narrative, which is something that we spend a lot of time doing. And we've got some techniques of how we can support critical thinking. So that's what we're doing here, is that through our relationships, through building our narratives, we can support people's more critical thinking in this space. First of all, I want to very quickly go through some things to avoid. And these are some classic things that we see quite frequently. As I've mentioned before, it's really important to avoid engaging with or amplifying false information, even to debunk it. And I will talk in a little bit about how we can address false information. But initially what we want to do is try and avoid it because of that repetition effect. Avoid leading with facts and science. That's not the way that we can open what we call open a side door for people. If our fast-thinking brains are in operation, then facts and science don't slow those fast-thinking brains down. They don't allow people to pause and think about maybe there's an alternative piece of information here that I need to consider. Avoid engaging with people's most self-interested motivations or fears. And this is, I think, probably not something that's done so frequently here in New Zealand, but certainly historically and in other countries in the vaccination space, there's a lot of self-interest that's used, a lot of vaccinate or else this terrible thing will happen to you. And I'll talk to you about why that is unhelpful and why fear isn't a particularly strong motivator, especially when we're dealing with some more complex issues. Avoid assuming your trusted expert is everyone's trusted expert. So just referring back to that shortcut I was talking about, that we use trust and expertise as a kind of mental shortcut, so we don't need to stop and reprocess information. Therefore, it's really important that we know who is considered an expert to all of our communities that we're talking to. We don't assume that because we have particular expertise that other people will see it. In fact, sometimes our own expertise will be the very reason why people don't trust us. And finally, we want to avoid framing vaccine hesitancy. You will have noticed there's a lot of talk about vaccine hesitancy in the media at the moment, but the more that we talk about it, the more it gives it social proof. There's a funny little thing that happens called pluralistic ignorance, where if people see that people are vaccine hesitant, they see it a lot and it's repeated, they may come to shift their thinking to perhaps be more hesitant because they think that's what most other people are thinking or feeling. So that's all the avoid. And what I'm going to give you now is what do we do instead if we can't do any of these things, and just suggest that we shouldn't do these things because of the evidence. What should we do instead? So we've got something called the BIC formula, and it's a 3-part solution. And I've used the BIC formula because we know that our fast-thinking brains remember little anagrams like this more easily. First of all, we want to build good narratives, and we call this the long game because this is not just about COVID, this is about vaccination more widely and how we want to build good, strong narratives around vaccination past this pandemic. We want to inoculate people against false information, and this is very different from debunking false information. I'll talk about what that involves. And if we do need to counter false information, I'll talk about the circumstances under which we would do that. There has to be a very specific formula applied, which is we call careful countering of false information, in order to avoid that bedding down or greater exposure to false information that we might be concerned about. So building good narratives, there are really 4 parts. The first is really about values. You would have, if some of you who would have heard me talk before would have heard me talk a lot about values. We need to give people a way to look at vaccination through what matters most to all of us. And by this, I really mean our collective values around, well, I'm sure a lot of you can think of the types of collective values, taking care of other people in our community, taking care of each other. And this is the antidote really to when I said don't or avoid giving people the reason to act on vaccination is through fear or self-interest. The antidote to that is to give people a way to look at vaccination through our collective well-being. And there's a huge body of research on why opening with these what we call intrinsic values is particularly important when we are talking about what is ultimately collective well-being issues, which vaccination is. We want to focus on the positive story of vaccination. So again, this is trying very hard to avoid a lot of the myth busting and negating and repeating of the false information. Instead, we want to spend our precious time and resources and energy on what's the positive story of vaccination and how can we construct communications through that. Hesitant people need to hear this, and they need to hear it through multiple channels and across multiple media outlets. So that's why I say rinse and repeat. This is what that looks like. I just want to give you a quick example of, now obviously this is a pharmaceutical company which we know can advertise direct to public in New Zealand, and so they can't in most other countries where they've used fear as a reason to vaccinate. And what you'll see on the other side is from a vaccination campaign some of you may have seen in Fremantle in Australia, where there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy and the types of values which I talked about, community and care and some identity issues we use there to start a conversation about vaccination. So the two other parts of building good narratives are using facts to help you explain how vaccination benefits us, not just that it does. So we tend to use facts very individually to try and replace kind of misinformation that people have, but people think in what we call a little causal chain. That's what A plus B equals C in. So like whole little stories, I guess. So when we want to use facts, we want to use facts like a character in that story. And so replacing whole stories for people about why vaccination matters, how it works, and what it leads to is much more impactful than just saying, for example, a statistic or a number about how vaccination works, or a statistic or a number about how many lives vaccination will save. And finally, we want to work with trusted people from across our communities to frame vaccine enthusiasm. So that's about having a very wide range of perceived experts and trusted people, all using this formula and the same story of telling a positive vaccine story. So that's the first bit around building better narratives. We can also inoculate people against false information. If we're particularly concerned that our communities are being exposed to false information or will be exposed to false information prior to them being exposed to it, we can warn them they will be exposed to it. We can describe the strategies and tactics used to undermine the truth. So this is very much about raising people's critical thinking. And we can talk about some of the motivations why people might, for example, spread false information about vaccine. We can provide the accurate information. We don't need to be specific about the false information in this case. So we can, again, avoid trying to repeat and spread the false information as much as we can. Inoculation is particularly effective if we are thinking about working with young people who might be exposed to it, or perhaps our older community members who might see it in social media, might have less, I guess, awareness of how social media acts. And we know that from some research, older members of our community can be more prone to believing false information on social media. And finally, if we do feel very powerfully that we need to counter false information, the first thing I would say is ask yourself, who are you doing this for? Is this important for me to counter false information because I fundamentally believe that it's wrong and I need to say something? Or am I saying it because I really believe that my community has been exposed to false information? So it's important to just explore our own motivations around countering false information. If we do believe that our communities are getting a kind of a tsunami of false information, we can carefully counter that. Again, opening with why this matters, shared collective values, emphasizing the facts and not the myths, giving very explicit warnings that information that you're going to talk about is false. It's important to provide an alternative explanation and motivation. So again, this is raising people's critical thinking as to why they might be exposed to false information, and then providing them with the core facts. And what we know is that graphic representations of core facts can be particularly impactful in terms of countering false information. So as much as we can pictorially depict the types of data that we want to get across to our communities, the better. And finally, I think I'm just about to hit my 20-minute mark. When we take some of this information down from a higher level, perhaps to into our interpersonal conversations, if we're health practitioners and we're having conversations with people who we feel might be hesitant, remember this is not an argument to be won, it's a relationship to build with people. Listen and don't debunk. You don't need to agree with people, but coming straight out and telling people why it's untrue will get their backs up. It can backfire. Tell them why you are getting vaccinated in terms of your shared values. Opening with a conversation about why this matters to you in a kind of collective sense can be a very powerful opening for people to consider information. You can give them the accurate information they need, but remember not to do this in a myth-busting or negating form. We can find ways to deliver accurate information that doesn't talk through the unhelpful or false information. We know from the research that telling them why you emphatically recommend that they get vaccinated is quite important. I know that some health professionals don't feel comfortable emphatically recommending, but we do see from the research that that does have a very powerful effect because you are the social proof they're looking for, especially if you are their trusted expert. And accepting that people may need to go away and think about it. And you can give them others to talk to when they do that, but don't feel that this is your only opportunity to get good information to people. There are multiple sources that they're being exposed to, and you can be one of many, giving them a positive space to really feel like they've been heard and listened to. And just finally, just a reminder that people are complex and contradictory, especially for people who might have hesitancy about vaccinations. People don't often hold one fixed view, and the way in which we communicate, the way in which we connect to people can shift people quite strongly and give them an opening, I guess, if you will, to consider the types of information that we need them to hear to make well-informed decisions. Okay, that's me.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Jess. And you kept under 20 minutes.
Did I?
Well done.
Excellent.
Now I'll just get, I'll just go to my participants. Where have they gone? Oh, here we are. And Anthony, what I'll do is I'll just ask you to start your video again and to unmute, and then we can, Jess, I'll hide yours. Great. And Anthony, we just got a little bit of focus issue on that camera, if we could.
I know. I didn't put Vaseline on the lens before. Is that better?
Great. Okay, that's looking much better. Over to you, Anthony.
All right. Share my screen. So thanks for that, Jess. Hopefully that frames up what I'm about to present well. It may actually... Does that come up all right, Theo?
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
All right. So there's a couple of things that I want to focus on after Jess's talk, and that's just to say, what's the situation both globally and in New Zealand in terms of where people are in terms of vaccine acceptance, what questions people are asking us, and what information we have to share. And hopefully that'll feed into the way in which Jess has presented how people think about vaccination. So there are now quite a number of both surveys worldwide, globally and in New Zealand, that have been undertaken to look at people's attitude towards vaccination for COVID-19. And these have been sampled both pre-vaccination programs being delivered, and then also once the vaccine program has been run out. So I think it's really important to say that the situation is evolving as we see vaccination roll out over time, and people are able to see what the type of system is that's delivering their vaccine, and also talk to other people who have been vaccinated. So I think it's quite an evolving situation to look at what people are thinking about, because some of the concerns and feelings on it may change as they start to be vaccinated and see others around them vaccinated. Now, this is a systematic review that was undertaken before mass vaccination was rolled out around the world. And you can see here that quite rudely, New Zealand has been dropped off the map, and I couldn't draw it on, but I assure you, we do exist. And knowing what people's baseline acceptance of vaccination for COVID-19 is very helpful for us to plan what sort of interventions and actions that we need to take place, and also to show us how well it's working when we start delivering them. And often these surveys, interestingly, show us where we need to strengthen trust in the healthcare system that is beyond just vaccination. So I think it probably gives us a snapshot in terms of where potentially we need to focus our efforts in terms of engaging with the population around health in general. In this survey, it showed that Asia was very pro COVID-19 vaccination, but areas of Central Europe, Eastern Europe and Russia and the Middle East were still relatively low in their acceptance rate. And we've conducted two widespread surveys here in New Zealand, one in September and then repeated again December of last year. And this was again both taken before we had started vaccinating our population. And that really shows a pretty static situation for us, where those that are likely to take a vaccine was around 70%, with some shifting in the unlikely demographic to the right. And then when we look at particular ethnic groups, there was a survey conducted by the Hui that looked at the Māori population that showed actually not too different results in terms of the likelihood that they would also take up a vaccine with a similar level of uncertainty to the right. And then a sample again, as we got closer and closer to the vaccine rollout, showed, again, we're probably not moving much here, that people are still similar rates. This survey showed maybe less acceptance to vaccinate and a bigger proportion of people that were still sitting on the fence, so to speak, around being unsure if they would take the vaccine, and required some persuasion or reinforcement of the benefits of being vaccinated. And I think that's what we're here to discuss today, is how do we provide that persuasion and reinforcement of benefits. And I'll just say that this survey was done globally, both pre and post vaccine rollout in a number of countries. And you can see, although the United States has been cut off at the bottom, and that wasn't intentional because they cut us off in the last survey, that in the space of a month, you can really shift people's perspectives on being vaccinated. And I'd just like to highlight that in Italy, where it was low as 58, 60%, they made a huge turnaround in under a month to get the population in behind them. So this is an achievable piece of work that has been demonstrated across the world. The question for us is, what caused this shift? You know, what is it that these countries did, apart from roll out the vaccine, that changed people's perspectives? And we can discuss that at the end. There's probably a lot of interesting data in there, but having a well-coordinated, available, free vaccination program where people start meeting other people that have been vaccinated is probably an incredibly potent stimulus to get vaccinated. So there are elements here that are more about how well our healthcare system reaches out and meets these people than just what we're publicising in the media. And this is really just to reinforce what Jess said, is we must appeal to people's community sense. There is a lot of people who are motivated and feel very responsible and hopeful by being vaccinated. And I would really encourage people to shift from just talking about the individual benefits of being vaccinated to the societal gains and collective gains that we make by vaccinating populations of people. And that's also reinforced by the Horizon survey, which showed here that the top four reasons to get vaccinated, 3 of those were community or whānau focused. They weren't about, so I can travel overseas. They're about, I actually want to protect my community, protect all of New Zealand, and protect those people around me. So it's really important to hear that that's the way that people are thinking, because that makes it really important in terms of what we communicate with those people and how we reinforce those positive behaviours. So what do people want to know? Well, like all surveys, you'll only get the answers that you ask, but actually the 2 most common things that people want to know about is the vaccine safe and does it work? And I think if you look through all of the trials and the surveys done on this, safety and side effects always come up. They're always at least the first or second most common asked question, quickly followed by, does the vaccine work? Okay, so if we're going to talk about this, we've got to talk in a way that answers the question that people have. And this is really just saying similar around the world. This isn't a New Zealand phenomenon. Everyone around the world is worried about side effects. They also worry about the rate at which this has been developed, and smaller proportion of people worried about that they don't think it's going to be effective. So what information do we have to share? Now, this is where I regress back into data overload. I think there's one thing you can say. We are in New Zealand using the vaccine produced by Pfizer and BioNTech, the most commonly rolled out vaccine in over 61 countries. So we're getting a lot of information in from all over the world to support what we're doing here in New Zealand. Similarly, ignore the left-hand side, which is the data overload that doctors are so commonly fixated on providing, but it's really just to say we've got a huge amount of data to support the side effects and the safety profile of vaccinating these people. Now, as of last week, over 80 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine have been delivered in the United States alone. Collectively across the world, that's up to 100 million. So when we're talking about safety of the COVID vaccine, we're actually able to be even more specific and talk about the safety of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccination with great certainty of seeing side effects by the time you've got to 100 million doses delivered worldwide. Remembering also that the Pfizer vaccine was one of the first vaccines to go into clinical trial, one of the first vaccines to be rolled out. So not only are we getting data based on the number of people vaccinated, but also the time since vaccination, because that's the other thing that people are worried about is this all feels like you don't know what's going to happen in 6 months or 12 months. And just to celebrate the work of everyone here that's delivering the vaccinations in New Zealand, you can see that huge steep increase of how we're going with our vaccinations here in New Zealand. And I'm very encouraged to tell you that as an allergist, there are no confirmed anaphylaxis reactions so far. I'm waiting until we get well beyond 1 million and hopefully we have none. But it's very early days for New Zealand in terms of monitoring for some of those conditions of interest that we always think about with vaccinations because they are incredibly rare. But that's where we rely on the international data to advise us on how many people are getting those conditions that we monitor alongside those unvaccinated populations where they're turning up as well. And one of the benefits of many of our systems is that just like overseas, we have a safety monitoring board here in New Zealand that's looking at the vaccine independently, as well as the Centre for Adverse Reactions Monitoring as part of the University of Otago's pharmacovigilance. So watch the space. They're very keen on making sure that we're watching carefully and reporting back any signals of concern for our vaccination rollout here in New Zealand, but also internationally. Now, this is where I sort of definitely regress back into being a medical professional is to produce a paper. But I guess the thing I want to highlight here is less about the facts, but more about how you turn these facts into a narrative like Jess talked about. The two things that people want to know is, did it work when you studied it in a clinical trial? You can say yes. That's where that 95% number comes from. Did it work when you rolled it out in a population where the people all had conditions, they weren't controlled for, they weren't highly selected? It represented what a population looks like. Well people, sick people, people on medications, people who got pregnant, people who were breastfeeding. That's the sort of data. So those are the two things that you can say with confidence with the Pfizer vaccine. We have studied both of those things. Okay? We've studied it in a highly controlled clinical trial, plus we've also studied it in a realistic setting, like a population of people that exist. This is a question that always comes up, and I think we just need to remind people, is this is what working collectively looks like. When you direct people to have a common goal, you release all of some of the constraints in terms of fiscal and collaborative constraints. This is what you can deliver, not in a short period of time, but in this period of time. We must stop saying this is a short period of time, because mRNA vaccines have been studied for decades now and have been used in other clinical trials before it was rolled out in COVID-19. So the science has been developing for decades. We've turned this into a realizable vaccine in the year since we started, because we were mandated and provided with the resources that we needed to deliver that. But there are a number of questions that we need ongoing answers for, and I think we have to be really open and honest with people that we are looking to answer these questions. We may not have all the answers now, and I'm still optimistic, given that data from the global survey that I showed you earlier, that we can still aim for a herd immunity strategy. How long will immunity last? I think I read the other day that we're probably out to 5 or 6 months of protective immunity, and we'll continue to monitor that. So you can still answer the question saying at least 5 or 6 months, and we'll continue to look about how long that protection lasts. Is it effective against newer mutations? Yes, it is effective against newer mutations, but not to the same level as we saw with the first SARS-CoV-2 strains. However, that's why we need to continue, just like we do with an influenza vaccine, updating it against those strains. There are studies going on for both pregnant women and children, and we will prove that it's safe in those populations as well. And I suspect, and I'd be interested in the others, that we may see this become a vaccine that joins our annualized schedule based on being updated for mutations, but watch the space again. Now, I would just support what Jess said, is there are useful infographics and there are very unhelpful infographics, but they do enable us to convey some of the information to questions that people have. And I've just put 2 up here around how do we develop a vaccine, because it's really important to show that no skipping of steps has happened during the development of this vaccine, and then sort of answering the common questions that people have. And I'd just say that always have a conversation. You'll never waste any time if you give someone your time to discuss whether or not they want a vaccination. I think we really need to stop talking about hesitancy. I think we just need to say it's a word that we can write in papers, but actually we must shift beyond that to talk about vaccine acceptance. And just like Jess was saying, we have to understand that the information that we provide needs to be digestible for anyone to discuss it. It's got to be digestible for the +1, the person I talk to, then takes that information and talks to someone else. Because actually, that's probably one of the most successful interventions, is that we start talking about the fact that I've been vaccinated, I was okay, because I suspect what we'll see is some of those changes in opinion in that survey over a month were because people were getting vaccinated and they were saying, it wasn't that bad. Yes, I had a sore arm, but it was okay. So providing easy to understand information that people can pass on is really, really important. And that's it from me, Theo.
Great, thanks very much for that, Anthony. And we're all keeping beautifully to time. So, folks, it's time for you to ask your questions. There's nothing burning from you yet, but I just might ask, I'll just get Jess and Karina to turn on their video. And yeah, so maybe while you're formulating your questions, we might just have a think about what we've been talking about today. And I guess I'm sort of interested in, from a health professional's perspective, how best you can sort of put these things into practice, Jess, in terms of, you know, informing the conversations that you have. And if you had any sort of tips on maybe even practicing them, something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You know, a lot of my research there, as you know, is we create good ways to talk about and explain complex issues like vaccination. But my experience has always been that a lot of this stuff does apply in terms of your interpersonal communications. And I think, like Anthony said, you'll never regret having a conversation. Well, you might regret having a conversation about vaccination, but you know, like having that conversation and stepping into it can be, I think, a little bit frightening for some health professionals. That's been my experience in the past, I think. And one of the things that can really help in this space is by having that conversation first about values. Like I really do find like opening with a why this matters is both important for your own kind of peace of mind, because we can all talk about why this stuff matters to us, right? Like that's actually meaningful and has resonance and is not that hard for us to do. But also it's, I think if people come in who are hesitant, they themselves can be quite anxious about bringing that up with a health professional. They may feel like they're going to have the kind of book thrown at them, and you actually don't want that. You want to encourage them to ask their questions. And so talking about why it matters, or the types of things that matters to them, can be a really non-threatening way to start those conversations, and practicing them with people is a really good way, actually. Yeah,
because I was also thinking, Anthony, from your presentation, we saw that safety was sort of both the main reason people were comfortable in being vaccinated, and also the main reason why they were sort of worried about it, which is always interesting. And in the context of having those values-based conversations, safety to me often comes across as quite a sort of a numbers game, and can be quite clinical. So I'm just sort of thinking about how you can turn that into a narrative for people and make it resonate from you know, as a within that framework.
I always, I think I try to avoid numbers. Numbers are how do I communicate to my colleagues, but never to a patient. I always use a reference point to say it is no different than something else that they may have familiarity to in terms of side effects, and also to give them reassurance that we monitor safety. This isn't you know, you're just not saying it's a binary step of stop monitoring it. What you get is what you get. It's all over and done. You have to reassure people that this is something that we're constantly evaluating, constantly looking at, to make sure, just like they read in the media, that there aren't any long-term unintended consequences of vaccination.
Livia, there were a couple of questions there that you were looking at. Sorry, just unmute yourself.
Anthony, quick question from Stephen. How does mRNA get into our cells?
So mRNA is packaged in a sort of lipid particle and then passes through the cell wall. And then once it's within the cell cytosol, it's the coating allows the mRNA to come out, and then it uses the cell sort of manufacturing processes to produce the antigen that it displays on its cell surface.
Looks like there's a question from Hugh about that there's an ongoing sort of contra view that these vaccinations are still effectively in phase 3 trials, which is true. They certainly are. And so by accepting vaccination, you are part of a medical trial, which you're not. Yeah. But I guess it's sort of a good way to explain that.
Sure. I always give the example of a trial can have many termination endpoints. And the Pfizer trial had a termination endpoint of reaching a primary efficacy endpoint of both efficacy and safety. That doesn't mean that they don't continue to monitor for other outcomes after that, but the outcome is an ongoing outcome that requires that passage of time. So, you know, some people in that diagram there would say we're in a post-marketing surveillance phase, but actually it's still a clinical trial phase because the trials have been asked to do it rather than the pharmacovigilance monitoring safety authorities.
But I guess it's getting back to the fact that not the numbers, but just the fact that this vaccine is being used overwhelmingly in so many countries that we're sort of beyond that point where you know, we have confidence in its safety for now and onwards, just because of the sheer volume of people who've been vaccinated.
And we get more confident as time passes as well.
Yeah.
And that reinforces the fact that the vaccine that we are using has now got many months of data behind it, showing that those other conditions that may be delayed in their presentation have not shown up from those early people that were vaccinated, even if they were rare events.
Hmm. And then there's another great one about from Dolly about her daughter got vaccinated in California, and she had the symptoms that you might expect, and more so with the second, the fever, the chills, she had diarrhea and aching for this sort of went on for about 36 hours after the second dose. It's that question of whether you share that information with people or not. Personally, I think that the story of side effects is one that needs to be told in context of the community benefit, I guess, where yes, these things happen, they demonstrate that your body is actually doing what it should. This is what you're seeing as a wonderful immune response on an individual level that leads to sort of collective protection. But Jess, did you want to add anything to that one?
No, I mean, I think that's a good approach. I wouldn't advocate like not saying anything, but we do have side effects. That's the reality of any intervention, and that's how people make informed decisions, right? They weigh up the benefits over the kind of the harms, I guess, if you will. And I think it's always really good when you're addressing any of people's concerns to be really clear on what the kind of what we call the meta story that you're telling us, and to frame it within that meta story, as opposed to getting kind of sucked down that path of having no, that's untrue, that's untrue, that's untrue. So the side effects, as you say, need to be framed in a story of what are the benefits of vaccination? What are the risks of COVID that we know? And these are some of the side effects that we'll get. This is how we monitor the safety. So the more information that you give people in an easy to digest form, the better, as opposed to single drops of facts or data that's not linked up with the kind of wider story.
And another sorry, Anthony.
It's almost like what Jess was saying about minimization. The more we minimize it, the more mistrustful they become. Like, if people are going to get muscle aches and pain at the injection site at the second dose of, up to 70%, we've got to be really upfront and say that isn't no longer a side effect. That's almost an intended consequence of waking the immune system up. So if we're free and frank with that information, people don't feel that something's being withheld from them, because this is something that if we do it right this time, if we need to do it again, we're not going to lose people. And we build trust in our healthcare system by being free and frank with our information. We'll lose people if we minimize it and say, no, don't worry about it, and don't offer any explanation.
I actually wonder if there's something useful in the inoculation theory here, which is it's probably useful to think about how we want to frame up that people might get exposed to false information around side effects and things like that. So actually there's a kind of you are inoculating them against potentially those side effects being raised as a sign that there's something wrong with the vaccination, as opposed to, a normal part of the vaccination process.
Yeah. So I've stopped talking about pain at the injection site and muscle aches and some of those things, which I, definitely expect people to have. So that's part of the vaccination process.
Great. Okay. Oh, sorry. Carry on, Olivia.
I have another question. What could different types of trusted individuals or information sources look like to help convey information in our Māori and Pacifica communities? How can we, as health professionals, help them?
Should we get Karina? Would you like to maybe talk about that one? I'll just get you to start your video.
Oh,
sorry, which I should have before, and I completely forgot. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. I mean, I think that's a great question, and that's something we've been trying to work on in the vaccine planning space. And I mean, Jess alluded to this in her presentation when she talked about, our trusted sources of information are not necessarily the sources of information that people in the community might go to. So in the Pacific space, we have been working closely with church ministers in particular and other community leaders. So we've had a series of whānau across the country, talking with health planners, church leaders, and we recognise that they will become really important champions in the community. And I think this goes back to what both Jess and Anthony have talked about. Actually, probably one of the most powerful things is hearing from someone that they've had a really positive vaccine experience. So that's what we're working on as well, is to make sure that everybody who does get a vaccination has a really positive experience and spreads the word. Because you can do as much communication as you want, as much education as you want, but actually it's, you know, hearing from your friend or your family that actually it was no big deal and now I'm protected and I've protected my family.
Thanks for that, Karina. Jess, how do you think the increased dialogue on vaccinations will impact the childhood immunisation program?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think if we get our narratives right, and if we think about the long game here, because I'm always, of course, thinking about not just what do our narratives do for this particular issue, but what do they do more widely for health and equity. I think if we get them right, then I can only see a positive effect, to be honest. And I have to say that, you know, people will understand more about vaccinations than they probably ever have, and that can only be a good thing by building up a kind of a deeper understanding in the public. So I think, yeah, I think focus on using those principles and we'll see some positive outcomes. And I would say, like, you know, just reflecting what Karina and Anthony says, that if we do the work of reaching out for communities who need us in the right ways, then obviously we know that access is one of the biggest issues for overcoming inequity in the vaccination space. So.
Thank you. Anthony, how effective is the vaccine in numbers in variant strains compared to usual strains? So we're wanting some numbers from Stephen.
I can share the numbers. They do drop off, and you know, we're looking somewhere between 50 to 60% for some of the worst outcomes from the South African strain, for example. And that's why I'd refocus that to say we're looking at improving the vaccine to target new strains and why we may have to update it. So it isn't to focus on the fact that there are new strains out there. Remember, new strains develop because of unfettered transmission throughout the community as the viral genome changes. Actually, what we're trying to do is, by vaccinating people, slow down the development of new mutations and allow us to adapt the vaccine to address the drop-off in efficacy. So that's a really good example of taking where someone's trying to say, but your vaccine doesn't work, into saying, hold on, I take the concept that you're talking about and actually we are addressing it to make sure that our vaccine is match fit.
Just to add to that, I would say that you could probably have a values conversation in that space where we talk about how innovation works and how creativity works, and that, you know, really talk a lot about how this is a collaborative exercise. We're constantly innovating and responding. You know, I think there's some really good, deep conversations that can be had in that space around those types of values that then reflect how it works, like how does the process actually work with all of the people involved in all of the processes.
Sort of going on from that, Jess, do you think it's beneficial in conversations to link the COVID vaccination program with previous successful rollouts, e.g. polio, smallpox, or is that confusing as COVID may not be able to be eradicated in the same way?
I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve in that space. I think it's useful to reflect on the types of cooperative, collaborative kind of work that we've done previously in the health space. I think people find it quite hard to think about things like polio. They're so distanced from it for a lot of the generation. I'm not, and also it can, I'm always very wary of a narrative around a kind of golden age where we did things really well when we know that there was a lot of inequity and a lot of people experienced a lot of harm in the healthcare system. So I think, yeah, you can do it, but do it carefully, if only to frame the kind of cooperative and collaborative kind of aspects of it as opposed to the actual vaccine.
Yeah, thank you. Karina, some of my nursing colleagues are hesitant about having the COVID vaccine. Would you talk to them in the same way?
Yeah, I was going to try and type that out, but I think actually nurses in particular, I think talking to them about values would be really important. I think nurses would probably, I've seen a campaign, one of our Pacific nurses say that we should have a campaign about getting the vaccine as actually an act of kindness and caring for our communities. And I actually really like that because it does appeal to our values. It isn't just, you know, people who are nurses are there to serve, you know, as health professionals, we are there to serve people. And I think it is really nice to think about vaccination as an act of kindness and caring to your patients, to your family, and to your community.
Thanks, Karina. That's great. We've got a couple more questions. One, Jonathan was just wondering about the evidence around values-led communication, such as, I mean, just the BIC model, I think, is looks like a New Zealand development, seeing it's BIC, but just sort of the evidence that these approaches work at a population level.
Yeah, so there is a combination of data to suggest that what we see is when intrinsic values are used at a community kind of population level, we see both a kind of set of ways of which people think, because obviously thinking precedes behaviours, and behaviours which are particularly around pro-community, pro-environmental, pro kind of well-being, collective well-being. There's also sets of randomized controlled trials where we see that we shift people's attitudes and actions. So relatively confident as much as you can be, you know, with all of the issues around replication science, so relatively confident that the body of research supports that intrinsic values will create the kind of deeper thinking and the kinds of shifts that we need. Of course, remembering that we're communicating into an existing environment, and if there's a whole lot of other narratives that are countering that, then it can be quite difficult. So we often talk about values-based communication, especially around intrinsic values, being as much about building a movement as anything, to kind of have a bit of a paradigm shift.
Right, well, I think that's probably it for the day. We've hit 1 o'clock. Were there any other last comments from our presenters and from Karina today?
I just want to say thanks. I learned a lot today. It was just absolutely fantastic presentations, and thanks to everyone for having me, and thanks for everyone for coming as well. Great.
Well, thanks everyone. With that, I'll bring it to a close, and just a reminder that yes, it will be available as a recording to watch on our website very soon. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.